My ex-girlfriend called me just before 3 a.m. "I need you to come get me, right now." I calmly replied, "You made your choice." She hung up without another word. The next morning, someone I had never spoken to before called my phone. The first sentence they said made me forget about going back to sleep. Before we dive into how this unfolded, hit that subscribe button to Vows Stories right now so you never miss another confession. I'm 34 and I work in financial administration for a regional healthcare network. The kind of job where I spend my days reconciling numbers that are supposed to match and usually don't. Insurance claims, reimbursement codes, vendor payments that get flagged for review because a decimal point moved somewhere it shouldn't have. It's tedious work most people would hate, but I've always found something almost calming about it. Numbers don't lie to you on purpose. When something's off, it's off for a reason, and if you're patient enough, the reason always surfaces. I bring that same patience into everything else in my life, whether I mean to or not, and I've come to understand that this instinct, the one that makes me good at my job, doesn't clock out when I leave the office. It follows me home, sits with me at dinner, listens in on conversations I'm not even trying to analyze. I should say, before I get into her, that I wasn't always like this. I used to be the kind of person who took things at face value, who believed that if someone told you something, you had no real reason to check it against anything else unless they'd given you a specific reason to. That changed slowly over the years, partly because of the job itself, and partly because of an earlier relationship that taught me, painfully, what it costs to assume good faith without verifying it. I don't like bringing that up much, but it matters here. Because by the time I met her, I was already a different version of myself than the one who might have taken those late nights and vague explanations at face value. She and I were together for a little under 2 years. We met through a mutual friend's barbecue, one of those overly hot afternoons in early summer where everyone's standing around a cooler pretending the heat isn't bothering them, sweat collecting under collars, someone's dog running circles around the yard, chasing nothing in particular. She was sharp, funny in a dry way that took people a second to catch up to, and she had this habit of finishing other people's sentences, not out of rudeness, but because she was always 3 steps ahead in a conversation. I liked that about her immediately. She wore this faded green jacket that day, too warm for the weather, and when I asked her about it later, she said it used to belong to her father, that she wore it sometimes even when it didn't make sense because it made her feel like he was still around somehow. I remember thinking that was the kind of detail you don't invent on the spot. It felt real. It felt like the beginning of knowing someone. What I didn't clock, not for a long time, was that being 3 steps ahead in conversation sometimes meant she was also 3 steps ahead in deciding what version of the truth she wanted to give you. That's not something you notice in someone during the first few months. It reveals itself slowly, the way water damage reveals itself on a ceiling, a small brown stain that you assume is nothing until one day it's spread across half the room and you realize it's been leaking for longer than you ever suspected. The first year was good. Genuinely good. Not the kind of good people say in hindsight to make a breakup sound more tragic than it was. We took a trip up the coast for her birthday, spent an entire weekend doing nothing but walking along the water and eating overpriced seafood we both pretended not to love, laughing about how we'd definitely order the same thing again, even though we complained about the price the whole time. She kept the little paper umbrella from a drink we shared that weekend, taped it inside a notebook she carried everywhere, right next to a pressed flower from some hike we'd taken the month before. Small things like that made me think we were building something that would last. I remember being genuinely happy during that stretch, the kind of happy where you stop checking your phone during dinner because you're actually present with the person across from you. It was near the end of that first year when the pattern started, so slowly I didn't register it as a pattern for months. She'd mentioned a coworker a handful of times, nothing that raised a flag on its own. People talk about coworkers. That's normal. That's expected in any relationship where both people work full jobs and spend more waking hours with colleagues than with each other some weeks. But the mentions had a specific shape to them. Always a little longer than necessary, always followed by a small laugh, like she was replaying something funny he'd said, rather than just reporting information to me. She'd say things like, "Oh, you'd actually really like him. He's got the same weird sense of humor as you." And at the time, I took that as a compliment, as her trying to connect two parts of her life. Looking back, I think it was something closer to rehearsal, testing out how comfortable she could get saying his name around me before it needed to mean something bigger. I noticed it the way I notice a claim that's been resubmitted 3 times with slightly different numbers each time. Not suspicious in isolation, suspicious in repetition. That's a distinction that matters in my line of work, and it turned out to matter just as much at home. A single odd data point is just noise. It's the second one, and the third, arriving in a pattern instead of randomly, that tells you something structural is happening underneath the surface. By the start of that second winter, the mentions had turned into late nights at the office that didn't match her actual schedule, which I only knew because I'd picked her up from that same office building enough times over the prior year to know when the lights usually went off on that floor. I never said anything about it directly, not at first. I told myself I was being paranoid, that comparing her explanations to a mental timeline I'd built without her knowledge was something closer to controlling than careful. That thought bothered me for weeks. I didn't want to become someone who quietly surveils the person he loves. But the habit that pays my bills doesn't have an off switch, and I've never figured out how to fully suppress it, even when I wanted to. I kept quietly noting the gaps, the way you'd flag a claim for later review without denying it outright, just marking it as something to watch, not something to act on yet. 2 weeks before everything actually broke, she started being cagier about her phone. Face down on the counter, notifications silenced, a habit she'd never had before in the entire time I'd known her. Before that winter, she used to leave her phone lying around, screen up, buzzing through dinner without a second thought. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency is the thing that turns a hunch into a hypothesis. I asked her about it once, gently, not accusing her of anything, just genuinely asking if everything was okay, sitting across from her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the smell of whatever she'd been cooking still thick in the air. "Everything's fine," she said, not looking up from the screen she'd just turned face down. "Why would you ask that?" "You just seem distracted lately, that's all." "I'm just stressed with work. Can we not do this right now?" I let it go. In my job, when someone gets defensive over a small, reasonable question, you don't push in that moment. You let it sit, and you wait for the next data point, because pushing too early only teaches the other party to get better at hiding whatever they're hiding. The next data point came about 10 days later, on a Thursday night, when she told me she was staying at her sister's for the weekend because her sister was going through something, some vague reference to a rough patch with her sister's own relationship and needed company. I didn't question it out loud. Her sister and I got along fine. We'd had dinner together plenty of times. There was no obvious reason to doubt it. But something about the way she said it, rehearsed, almost too smooth, delivered with her eyes fixed slightly too steadily on mine instead of drifting naturally the way eyes do during ordinary conversation, sat wrong with me the same way an invoice sits wrong when the total's correct, but the line items don't actually add up to it. You can present a number that looks fine on the surface and still know instinctively that the math behind it doesn't hold. That Saturday night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet without her in it, which struck me as strange because I've always been someone who's comfortable with solitude. I told myself it was nothing, made myself a cup of tea I barely touched, sat in the living room with the television on low volume just for the noise, some late-night rerun neither entertaining nor distracting enough to actually hold my attention. Around 11, out of habit more than suspicion, I sent her sister a text, something casual, asking how she was holding up, hoping she was feeling better, the kind of message you send without expecting it to unravel anything. Her sister responded within a few minutes, confused, saying she'd actually been at a work conference out of state all weekend and had no idea what I meant. She even sent a follow-up message asking if everything was okay with me, since the question seemed to come out of nowhere on her end. I sat with that message for a long time before I did anything with it, the phone resting on my knee, the muted television flickering shapes across the dark living room. In compliance work, once you find one falsified data point, you don't act on it immediately. You go back through everything else with fresh eyes, because if one number was wrong, the whole file needs to be re-audited, not just patched over in isolation. I didn't call her. I didn't text her demanding an explanation. I just sat there in the quiet living room, running back through every late night, every face-down phone, every laugh about a coworker whose name I now recognized in a completely different light, and watched the whole picture rearrange itself into something much clearer than I wanted it to be. It's a strange, sinking feeling, watching months of small, dismissed observations suddenly snap into a single coherent shape. Not shocking exactly, more like finally seeing the whole diagram after staring at disconnected fragments of it for months. By the time she came home Sunday evening, walking in with her bag over one shoulder and a takeout coffee cup in hand like it was any other weekend, I hadn't fully decided what I was going to say. I wasn't interested in a screaming match or an ultimatum delivered with my voice shaking. That's never been how I operate, not because I don't feel things intensely, but because I've learned that volume rarely produces truth. It usually just produces a better defended lie. I wanted information first, calm and complete, the same way I'd want a full file before flagging an account for review rather than accusing someone based on a hunch alone. I asked her, plainly, setting my own coffee down on the counter, how her sister was doing. She barely hesitated, answering almost too quickly, like the response was already loaded. She's doing better. Still a rough patch, but better. That's strange, I said, keeping my voice level. Because she told me last night she was at a work conference all weekend. The color left her face slower than you'd expect, like watching someone realize a door they thought was locked had actually been open the whole time, letting all the cold air in without them noticing until just now. She didn't answer right away. She set her bag down on a kitchen chair, sat down herself, and for a moment just stared at the counter between us, like she was trying to find a version of the truth that could still salvage something. When she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It was an explanation stitched together out of half-truths, something about needing space, about an old friend she'd reconnected with, about how nothing had really happened yet. The word yet doing a lot of unspoken work in that sentence, hanging there between us heavier than anything else she'd said. So, there's someone, I said, not as a question. It's not what you think, she said quickly. We've just been talking. It's not, I haven't done anything with him, I swear. But you lied about where you were. You had your sister ready to be an alibi she didn't even know she was giving. I panicked, she said. I didn't know how else to explain wanting space without you making it into something bigger than it was. It became something bigger the moment you needed a fake weekend to have it, I said. I didn't yell. I remember feeling strangely calm, the same flat, procedural calm I get when a suspicious claim finally confirms itself as fraud after weeks of quiet suspicion. There's no satisfaction in it, just a quiet settling. Like a puzzle piece finally clicking somewhere ugly but accurate, the picture complete even though you wish it had turned out to show something else entirely. We didn't break up that night. That part surprised even me. I told her I needed time to think, and she stayed in the guest room for the next several days while I quietly decided what I actually wanted, moving through the house in that strange, careful way two people do when they're avoiding each other without actually saying so. Timing kitchen visits so we wouldn't overlap, keeping doors half closed instead of fully shut, as if leaving them ajar somehow softened the distance between us. It wasn't dramatic. It was just methodical, the way everything in my life tends to be, even the parts I wish could just be allowed to feel messy for once. By the following weekend, I told her plainly, sitting across from her in the same kitchen where all of this had first cracked open, that I didn't think we should continue. That trust wasn't something I could rebuild, off an explanation, with that many gaps in it. She cried, she apologized, she asked for another chance in the vague, general way people do when they're more sorry about getting caught than about what they actually did. She said things like, I never meant for it to go this far. which struck me as an odd thing to say about something she claimed hadn't gone anywhere at all. I stayed calm through all of it. I'd already run the numbers, quietly, over days, and the conclusion didn't change no matter how many times she re-ran them in front of me, no matter how many new details she offered up in the hope that one of them might change my mind. She moved out over the following month, taking her things in stages, a few boxes at a time, until one Saturday afternoon the apartment just felt different, lighter in some rooms and strangely hollow in others. For a while, that was that. We didn't talk. I deleted the shared photo album from my phone eventually, not out of anger, just because looking at it felt like reviewing a file I'd already closed. Almost 4 months later, on a weeknight, my phone rang just before 3 in the morning. I don't sleep with my phone on silent, mostly out of old habit from years of being on call for month-end financial closes, back when a system error at 2 a.m. meant someone needed to be reachable immediately. So the ring pulled me straight out of sleep, sharp and disorienting in the dark bedroom. Her name was still saved the same way it always had been, no dramatic renaming, no bitterness baked into the contact itself, and seeing it lit up on the screen at that hour did something strange to my stomach, a mix of concern and something colder underneath it that I couldn't fully name in the moment. I answered, my voice still thick with sleep, throat dry. "Hello? I need you to come get me," she said, fast, breathless, the words tumbling out almost on top of each other. "Right now." "Where are you?" I asked, sitting up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed out of instinct before my brain had even caught up to the situation. "It doesn't matter, just, please, I need you to come get me." There was noise behind her, distant, hard to place, maybe a parking lot, maybe a street corner somewhere. The faint sound of a car passing, someone's voice too far away to make out words. Her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard before, not quite panic, but close to it, something taut underneath the breathlessness. If you were standing in that room hearing this, would you stay quiet or speak up? Tell me in the comments right now. I sat there in the dark for a moment, phone pressed to my ear, running through everything as fast as my half-asleep brain would let me, the same way I'd scan a spreadsheet for the one line that didn't belong. 4 months of complete silence, no calls, no messages, nothing. No context now for where she was or why she needed me specifically at 3 in the morning, instead of the person she'd left me for, or a friend, or her sister, or anyone else in her life who wasn't the man she'd walked away from months earlier without so much as a follow-up conversation. "Why me?" I asked, quietly, genuinely wanting to know, not as an accusation, but as an actual question. "Please, can we not do this right now? I just need you to come." Something about the phrase, "can we not do this right now," landed harder than it should have. It was the exact phrase she'd used months earlier, standing in our kitchen with her phone face down, deflecting a question instead of answering it. Old habits apparently didn't disappear just because the relationship had ended. She was still using the same tools to avoid the same kind of scrutiny, just aimed at a different situation now. "You made your choice," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, almost flat. The same tone I use when I close out a file that's finally resolved itself after weeks of back and forth. Not cruel, just final, the way a decision sounds when it's already been made somewhere deep down, long before the moment actually requires you to say it out loud. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped, long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the screen. Then she hung up without another word. The silence afterward somehow louder than the call itself had been. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay there in the dark, running through every possible reason she might have called, telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to solve, that people create their own emergencies sometimes and expect old numbers to still be operational when they need them, like an account they closed but assume they can still draw from in a pinch. I believed that, mostly. But there was a small, quieter part of me that stayed awake a while longer than I wanted to admit, staring at the ceiling fan barely visible in the dark, wondering if I'd just made the right call or a hard one that happened to look right in the moment and would feel different in the morning. The next morning, a little after 9, my phone rang again. A number I didn't recognize. No name attached, no context. I almost let it go to voicemail, still tired, still a little unsettled from the night before, my coffee barely started on the counter behind me. But something made me pick up anyway, some leftover instinct from the night that told me this wasn't unrelated. "Is this her ex?" the voice said, a man's voice, unfamiliar, tense in a way that immediately put me on alert. Not aggressive. Careful, like someone choosing words they'd rehearsed on the drive over to making this call. The kind of caution you hear in someone who's spent the last several hours thinking through exactly how to open a conversation they didn't want to have. "Who's asking?" I said, keeping my tone neutral, setting my own coffee mug down slowly on the counter. "I'm the guy she's been seeing. Was seeing. I don't really know what to call it anymore, honestly." I didn't say anything right away, letting him fill the silence, the same way I let a vendor talk when their explanation for a discrepancy is still forming in real time, because people reveal more when they're allowed to keep talking than when you interrupt them with your own theory too early. "Look, I don't know exactly what happened last night," he continued, his voice tightening slightly. "But she showed up at my place around 3:30 in the morning, completely shaken, mascara everywhere, could barely get a full sentence out. And when I finally got her calmed down enough to ask what was going on, she said she'd called you first, not me, you, and you told her she'd made her choice." I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to a stranger describe a version of the night before that I hadn't fully processed myself yet. The details landing with a strange weight, like hearing your own voice played back on a recording. "I'm not calling to start anything," he said. I don't know. I guess I wanted to understand what actually happened between you two. Because whatever it is, it's still sitting in the middle of whatever this is with us, and I'm tired of not knowing the full picture." She talks around things. "I've noticed that. I just didn't realize how far back it went." That last line stayed with me longer than anything else he said. I told him, calmly, that I wasn't going to lay out the entire history of a relationship that ended months ago to a man I'd never spoken to before this call. Mostly because it wasn't fair to either of us to be building conclusions off second-hand information delivered at 9 in the morning over the phone. But I did tell him one thing, because it felt like the only honest, useful thing worth saying. The kind of statement I'd want handed to me if our positions were reversed. "If she's calling me at 3 in the morning while she's with you," I said, "that's not really information about me. That's information about her." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I could hear some ambient noise on his end, a chair creaking, maybe him sitting down somewhere. "Yeah," he said eventually. "I think I already knew that. I just needed to hear someone else say it out loud." We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say, really. He thanked me, in an odd, formal way, for being straightforward instead of using the moment to make himself look better at her expense, which I appreciated him noticing, since it honestly hadn't occurred to me to do otherwise. I've never seen much use in scoring points off someone else's unraveling relationship, even when it involves a person who once hurt you. I heard, through the same mutual friend who'd introduced us at that barbecue 2 years earlier, that things between her and the new guy fell apart not long after that call, the trust already too thin to hold weight once he started asking the questions she clearly hadn't wanted him to ask. Apparently, the 3 a.m. incident wasn't an isolated thing either, just the first one loud enough to actually reach me. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as some kind of quiet revenge arc, but that's not what it felt like. Mostly, I felt the same flat confirmation I always feel when a pattern completes itself exactly the way the earlier data suggested it would, the kind of feeling that doesn't come with celebration attached to it, just recognition. These days, I still work the same job, still spend my hours matching numbers that are supposed to align and don't always, still flag the occasional file that doesn't add up the way someone insists it should. I've thought about that 3 a.m. phone call more than I probably should, turning it over some nights the way you turn over a decision you're still not entirely sure was fair, even when you know it was necessary. Not because I regret what I said, but because I think it was the first time in my life I trusted my own audit completely. No second guessing, no softening the finding just to keep the peace, no talking myself into a gentler interpretation just because gentler would have felt easier in the moment. I've started dating again recently, cautiously. The way you'd approach any process you've learned can go wrong in ways you don't always see coming until it's too late. I notice myself paying closer attention now. Not obsessively, but honestly, trusting the small inconsistencies enough to ask about them early instead of waiting months to let them pile into something undeniable. Some people would call that cold or guarded, or maybe even a little exhausting to be around. I've made peace with calling it honest, because I've learned the hard way what happens when you don't. What do you think was going through her mind when the truth finally came out? Drop your honest thoughts below and let me know what kind of story you want to hear next on this channel.